Welcome to today's webinar focusing on the Marie Skłodowska-Curie project funding, primarily determined by these fixed unit contributions, which we will be focusing on today. I hope you can all hear us, that our voices are traveling well, or else please write a note in the chat and then we'll try and fix any difficulties. My name is Anne Meiber, and I am joined by my colleague today, Marlies Eriksen. Good morning. And Marlies and I both work with the Marie Skłodowska-Curie program here at the Danish Agency for Higher Education and Science. And it is in that capacity that we've set up this webinar today. Today we've invited Louise Byrne, who is head of sector at the Financial Support and Verification in the European Research Executive Agency. Louise will be the one to guide us through the unit contributions, how to budget them, how to use them, and what is needed to document the use. Special attention today is on the postdoctoral fellowships, as well as the doctoral networks. But I know that Louise will also cover the other actions in MSCA. Louise, we're very happy that you were able to join today and to present for us. Thank you very much for your time and your availability. And then just a few sort of practicalities. We are recording the webinar today. We will publish the recording on our YouTube channel, and we'll also send you the recording as well as the presentation from the webinar today. You're welcome to have your camera turned on so we can see you, but if you do not wish to have your image on the recording, you should turn your camera off. Yes, and then about questions, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar. Please write them in the chat, and then Louise, Marlies, and I will answer the questions, the ones that we can anyways, throughout the webinar. We have added some breaks where we will follow up on the questions. And I'll just share a couple of slides here. 1 second. I hope you can all see the slides now. Or else,
yes, somebody's nodding.
Someone's nodding. Yeah. That's good. And just to quickly run through the agenda for the webinar today, we've invited Louise to cover some of the areas which we often receive questions relating to. First, the budget categories in MSCA, and here Louise will also introduce the two new categories, the long-term leave allowance and the special needs allowance. Then Louise will also talk about how it's possible to transfer budget and also clarify how the use of unit contributions need to be reported and documented. And as I said, please feel free to answer questions. We will have a couple of Q&A breaks throughout. Before I give the floor to Louise, I just have a couple of slides that I want to present, sort of to clarify what role is it that Marlies and I here have at the Agency for Higher Education and Science. Marlies and I are both based in an office known as Eurocenter. And here we, along with about 20 colleagues, we are national contact points for Horizon Europe. And in that capacity, we offer counseling and information about the opportunities, the requirements, and the rules for funding in Horizon Europe. We are also delegates to the program committee, Marlies and I, for MSCA. And here we represent Denmark and sort of the Danish position in the negotiations about specifically the work programs. In Eurocenter, we have a long list of activities which are focused on promoting Horizon Europe and the opportunities in the program. So we have a web universe that focuses on the Horizon Europe program. And we also have a publication that you see here also on the screen, EU Inblick, where we zoom in on sort of specific themes in the program. We also conduct a number of webinars, information meetings, and we publish podcasts, handbooks, guidelines, etc. So there's some use in following our website and our newsletter on that website. Then also it's possible to follow us on social media, on our LinkedIn account and our Twitter account. And I think that was sort of it for me for the introduction. So I'll stop my sharing and I'll let you share your slides, Louise. Perfect. The floor is yours, Louise.
Great. Thank you, Anna. So good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you today about the financial aspects of the Myers-Sklodowska-Curie actions in Horizon Europe. I have quite a lot of information to impart in just under an hour, so I will jump right in to the presentation, and I will show you first the budget tables. So as Anna said, we'll mostly focus on doctoral networks and postdoctoral fellowships today, but I will also show you some aspects of staff exchange and co-fund, and to a much lesser extent MSCA and citizens. So here is the budget table for doctoral networks and postdoctoral fellowships. It's all very familiar to those of you that are familiar with Horizon 2020, except for two allowances, the long-term leave allowance and the special needs allowance. And I will go into those in more detail later. But the rest of the allowances are the same as Horizon 2020, just updated. So in 2018, I believe, we undertook a study, DG Education and Culture with the Research Executive Agency undertook a study to look at the Horizon 2020 costs and to update them for Horizon Europe, and also to design the overall financial structure of the Myers-Sklodowska-Curie actions in Horizon Europe. Like the overall evolution from Horizon 2020 to Horizon Europe, the theme is continuity, and it's evolution, not revolution. So it should hopefully be very familiar to you in most of the categories. So you have the contributions for the recruited researchers, which is the living allowance, the mobility allowance, and the family allowance. Then you have the two new categories. And again, like in Horizon 2020, you have the institutional contributions. I'm going to go into all of those in more detail shortly. Looking at the staff exchanges, again, it's quite similar, but like the postdoctoral networks and the doctoral fellowships, we have new allowances. So we don't have a long-term leave allowance in staff exchange, but we do have the special needs allowance. So you'll see in staff exchanges, there has been somewhat of a redistribution of the budget between the institutional contributions and the top-up allowance, but the changes are quite minor overall. Similarly, in co-fund, we have the co-fund allowance, which is funding the researcher. And then we also have the long-term leave and special needs allowance there. But the main cost categories across all the actions remain the same. And just very briefly, MSCA and citizens is lump sum funding, and the lump sum, it should normally be between 50,000 and 150,000, but it doesn't have to be. So applicants can propose a different lump sum, and that will be assessed by the experts. Looking at the individual cost categories, we look first at the contributions for the researcher and staff member or staff member. So researcher for postdoctoral fellowships and doctoral networks, and staff member for staff exchange. So you have the living allowance in doctoral networks and postdoctoral fellowships, DN and PF. So like Horizon 2020, the living allowance is subject to a country-specific correction coefficient, and the rates are the average of the 7-year period past, and they're published in the work program. So for Denmark, you will see the rate is 132%. Now, for the living allowance, the researchers have to be recruited under an employment contract or equivalent direct contract with full social security coverage. In the rare event that an employment contract cannot be provided due to national legislation, a fixed amount fellowship is allowed. And in this case, the amount of the living allowance is halved. But the researcher must still enjoy the minimum social security coverage in their country of employment. All very, very similar to Horizon 20, all the same, in fact, as Horizon 2020, only the amounts have changed. So the mobility allowance, again, it's in DN and PF, and it's to cover the costs related to the mobility of recruited researchers. So I understand from Anne and from Marlies that there's frequently questions about how the mobility allowance can be used. So I'd just like to make it clear that the mobility allowance is for private costs of the researchers. It's not professional costs. These are covered by the category research training and networking contribution. So you cannot ask the researcher to pay, for example, travel to attend a conference out of their mobility allowance. Similarly, it cannot be used for the costs associated with short-term secondments. So if a researcher is going on a short-term secondment, they should also be covered from the budget category research training and networking contribution. The mobility allowance is very much seen as the private costs that the fellow has due to the compulsory mobility in the Marie Skłodowska-Curie actions. Then we have the family allowance. And this is for researchers with family to reduce family-related obstacles to research and mobility. Now, this is where things start to change in Horizon Europe. So for those of you that remember Horizon 2020, the eligibility for the family allowance was determined at the time of the appointment of the researcher in doctoral networks, well, ITN, or at the call deadline for the individual fellowships. However, in Horizon Europe, if the researcher acquires family obligations during the action, then they become eligible for a family allowance from that point. So this means that during the action, the researcher might go from having no family allowance to having a family allowance, which has impacts on the budget. So we may, if necessary, update the maximum grant amount via an amendment in this case. It won't always be necessary because, for example, in doctoral networks, we have assumed at the time of the gap that 70% of the researchers have family obligations. And similarly, the budget that is funded is foreseen is for full 36-month fellowships for doctoral networks. So it may be that if there's a delay in recruitment for one or more fellows, or a fellow leaves early, there might be enough funds left to already cover this. So therefore, if we will decide, or we will see, it's not we will decide, we will see at the end, towards the end of the grant, if an increase is necessary. It will always be granted if it's necessary, but it's just, we will wait until the end of the grant to see if it's necessary. So that we can look at the grant as a whole and see the situation. Then we have the top-up allowance from staff exchanges. And this is to contribute to the travel, accommodation and subsistence costs related to the secondment. As with Horizon 2020, there will be a pro rata for partial months of secondment. And we consider that each month has 30 days, and the pro rata is a daily rate of 1/30th. Of course, there is the minimum requirement of the minimum duration of a secondment. So at the end of the grant, the minimum duration will have to be completed in order for these pro rata, these partial months to be eligible. So a partial month less than a month will only become eligible once the minimum duration of 1 month has been completed. Any partial months above 1 month are automatically eligible if the researcher is eligible. So the research, training and networking costs are not covered under this budget category. You will receive these in the institutional contributions. So the top-up allowance must be used for the researcher. It doesn't have to be paid to the researcher. It can be used to pay their costs of accommodation, for example, or it can be used to, it can be partially paid in terms of a per diem for subsistence and accommodation paid, but you have to make sure that the full amount is used for the researcher and keep documentation on that. So I'm going to start now in a minute on the new contributions for the researcher, so the long-term leave and the special needs. But before I do that, are there any questions on what we have seen so far? I see one hand raised. Marlies, Anne, will you take care of the unmuting?
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear us, Louise?
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
There was something with our microphone, but it should be working now. So there was one question. The question is, what happens if fellow gets divorced during the action?
At the moment, the way the grant is, the way it's written is if the fellow acquires a family status. It's not written at the moment that the fellow will lose the family status. I will ask that that is clarified in the annotated grant agreement. So as my interpretation of it is, it acquires a family allowance. But indeed, this is something we should address clearly. I will ask it to be put in the, I'll ask for it to be mentioned in the annotated grant agreement. And we still have a hand raised.
Yeah, I see we have one hand raised. That was the same question, I think, about what happens if fellow gets divorced. If it's another question that you want to ask, you're welcome to unmute and ask the question. If not, I'm just going to assume that it was the question that was just answered. Then we have one more question that has come in. I don't know if you can see it yourself, Louise, as well.
I can, but it's related. Hi, Paul. Nice to see you again. It's related to the next section, so it will be answered very shortly.
Yes. So let's keep that question until later if it doesn't get answered during your next segment, Louise. So no further questions for now. So we can continue and do questions again later.
Okay. So I will stop again after these new contributions to take questions on these, because I think this is where there are going to be the highest number of questions. So as soon as I present these two cost categories, we'll stop again for questions. So in Horizon Europe, we were asked to find unit costs to cover the long-term leave allowance and the special needs allowance. So long-term leave was not funded in Horizon 2020, which meant that if you had a researcher on sick leave, on maternity, paternity leave, parental leave, then you as beneficiaries had to bear the cost of this. So we needed to correct this. As part of the study, we looked at the social security all across Europe and wider, and we soon determined that it was not possible to come up with a single unit cost. So what I will introduce here is how we have adapted the unit cost to the very, very different legislation and wage agreements across Europe and wider. So this is an allowance covering the beneficiary's obligations during absences of longer than 30 days. Like the family allowance, if needed, the maximum grant amount will be increased. It might not always be needed for the reasons I explained previously. So again, we will look at it towards the end of the grant. The other reason for waiting towards the end of the grant is we then have a full picture of all the increased family allowances, the increased leave, the long-term leaves, and we know exactly how much the maximum grant amount needs to be increased by as a total. Now, during the long-term leave allowance, the fellow isn't working on the action, so all other contributions will be reduced to 0 for the period of which the long-term leave applies. I will explain how it works in the next slide. So just as a summary, it's the personnel costs incurred by the beneficiaries that are not reimbursed by Social Security or other sources in case of researchers' leave of maternity, paternity, parental, sick, or special leave. It's for absences longer than 30 consecutive days, so anything less than 30 days does not count as an absence. The basis for the allowance is the sum of the living and mobility allowances. So the correction coefficient will also apply here. And it's also the minimum salary required under Cofund. Now, if you pay a top-up to the researcher, so if you top up their salary, that will not be considered as part of the allowance. So it's only up to the maximum living and mobility allowance that's established in the grant agreement. How does it work? So the beneficiary introduces a request in the mobility declaration. So what you will do is you will suspend the fellowship, not the grant, and that's very important in terms of postdoctoral fellowships. It's not a suspension to the grant. The grant has to continue to run if the costs are to be eligible. So do not ask for suspension of the grant agreement, ask instead for the long-term leave allowance in the case of an absence for which you are paying Social Security contributions, or you're still paying the salary, part of the salary of the researcher, the rest paid by Social Security. So you introduce it in the mobility declaration, and then the request will be assessed by the project officer to make sure it falls into one of the categories we have. So maternity, paternity, parental, sick, or special leave. And the project officer will then confirm the request. So towards the end of the project, we will modify the grant via an amendment to activate the allowance and if necessary, to increase the maximum grant amount. How do we calculate it? So, as I mentioned, the basis is the living and mobility allowance. And then we multiply it by the percentage of the allowance incurred by the beneficiary. So if you have to pay different percentages at different stages of the absence, so say for the first 2 weeks, you have to pay 100% of the salary. And by the end of the absence, you're only paying 30% of the salary. You take the average over the entire period and use that percentage. And then it's multiplied by the number of months. In practical terms, here's an example. So this example, we have a researcher from a doctoral network who's on sick leave for 4 months. The fellowship is suspended during this period. Fellowship, not the grant. The living and mobility allowances, so this is a fellow that's working with a with the 100% country correction coefficient. So we can say a researcher in Belgium, for example. So the salary and the living and mobility allowances is €4,000. In this example, we say the beneficiary overall had to pay 20% of this amount during the 4 months. The rest was paid by the social security coverage. So the unit cost and the total cost in the long-term leave allowance category are, first of all, for the unit cost, it's the living and mobility by 20%, which is €800. Then the salary, so the total unit cost, the total long-term leave allowance we will give will be the unit cost by 4 months, and that's 3,200. So this is the amount of the beneficiary's obligation to be reimbursed to the researcher during their sick leave. Okay, so looking at the special needs allowance. Again, we looked trying to come up with a range of unit costs, one unit cost or a range of unit costs that could apply to the special needs. We worked with disability organizations. We took statistics from the special needs lump sum grant agreement as well. And we found it very difficult to come up with a unique unit cost or even 1 or 2 unit costs. So again, we have a range of unit costs that can be used to cover these special needs. Now, in Horizon 2020, there was a separate grant agreement, a special needs lump sum grant agreement. The feedback we got from beneficiaries and from fellows was that this was very burdensome. So they had to write a proposal. The proposal had to be evaluated using all the evaluation criteria, including excellence, which doesn't seem correct for a special needs allowance. So therefore, to facilitate everybody, this has been introduced into the main grant agreement. And like the family allowance and the long-term leave allowance, the maximum grant amount can be increased by an amendment. Also, these special needs items or services must not have been funded from another source. So there can be no double funding with Social Security or health insurance. And the special needs contribution is capped at €60,000 per researcher with disability. So this cap is the same as existed in Horizon 2020. So what does the special needs allowance contribute to? It's basically, it helps with the additional costs for the acquisition of special needs items. It can be, for example, assistance by a third person, adaptation of a work environment, additional travel, transportation costs, and it's requested when the need arises. So in doctoral networks and co-fund, and staff exchange, you don't know the staff member necessarily that's going to be seconded during staff exchange at the time of gap. And in doctoral networks and co-fund, you cannot know the researchers you're going to recruit because you have to do an open recruitment. So therefore, it's added during grant implementation in these cases. However, for postdoctoral fellowships, if the special needs allowance is necessary, it can be included during gap because they're the researcher. It's a grant with an identified researcher. That doesn't mean it can't be added later. It can, but it can already be foreseen during GAP. How is it requested? In the same way as the long-term leave allowance is requested, so it's introduced in the mobility declaration. However, we do need an explanation, a justification of why the special needs should be provided. The template and the procedure is under development at this time, and the request will be evaluated by REA. In the case of the special needs allowance, we reserve the right to also ask an expert monitor, because the requests can be very specific. So we have a team of experts that we used that worked with us to evaluate the proposals for the special needs lump sums, and we can ask them or another expert to assist us in assessing if the allowance is eligible. So the project officer, if the allowance is eligible, will confirm the request, and then we modify the grant via an amendment, and this amendment is done towards the end of the project. And as I mentioned, if necessary, the maximum grant amount is increased. So how did we come up with the special needs lump sum or unit cost? It was very, very difficult to find a unit cost. Really, the contractor we had working with us doing the study did a lot of research into this and came up with very broad range of costs. So what we decided to do was to come up with 10 rates. So we will reimburse one of these 10 rates, and then it will be split across the remaining number of months in the fellowship or in the staff secondment as a unit cost. So the amount of support you will get for a researcher with special needs will be between 3,000 and 6,000 euro. Now, it's not allowed to make a profit in these grants, so it's always the closest lower rate. So, for example, if you had a researcher that needed to buy a special screen that cost 3,000 euro, 3,300 euro, for example, we would reimburse 3,000 of that. And here I will show you how we calculate it as a unit cost. So in this example, the requested amount is 20,000 euro. The closest lowest rate from the previous slide is, as you can see, 18,500. So we don't have a rate of 20,000, we will come down to 18,500. In this example, we are saying the remaining number of months for the researcher in the project is 25 months. So the unit cost is calculated by taking the amount of assistance we will provide, the 18,500, dividing it by the number of months remaining in the fellowship. And therefore the unit cost is 750 euro a month. So those are the two new cost categories. So I will stop sharing now and pause for questions.
Thank you, Louise. So we still have Paul's question, and maybe it was already answered during your presentation, Louise, but Paul, if we should clarify further, you're welcome to unmute and state the question, or if everything's okay.
Well, actually, thank you, Louise, again. It's always good to see your presentations. I assume we get them afterwards. Yes. And because a percentage is always complicated, even professors do it wrong. Percentage of what? And I think we agree that you should have a percentage of what are your real extra costs divided by something. And in my example, if we pay the fellow 4,000 per month, and for some reason we get 3,000 reimbursed by the government, then our real extra cost would only be 1,000,
Yes.
which we would like to have covered. And that would fit in my example here as cost not covered by the beneficiary. So it's just a matter of words, but could you confirm my calculation or not?
It's, yeah, as you say, it's a matter of words. So when we talk about the percentage, we're talking about the money paid to the researcher, whereas you're applying the same percentage, but you're applying it to the amounts covered by the Social Security. Whereas when we're talking about it, it's the amounts paid by the researcher. So we're both doing the same calculation, we're just explaining it in different ways.
Yeah. So maybe it should be clarified in the annotated grant agreement, just to make sure that we have a good example. Everybody can understand.
There will be a very detailed explanation in the model, in the annotated model grant agreement.
Thank you.
All right, well, we don't have any more questions at this point, Louise. If someone feels more comfortable unmuting and asking a question, that's also an option. You can just raise your hand if you prefer to ask question via your microphone and not add it in the chat, or else questions are continuously welcome in the chat, and we can do a final Q&A break when we reach the end, Louise. So see if there's more questions at that point.
Yeah, there will be, because nobody has worked with these allowances yet, it might be that the questions will come once you start to work with them. And then you can, of course, direct the questions to us via the project officer. So we'll always be able to answer the questions when you encounter the costs in real life, rather than in a presentation. Paul, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah. One more question, because all the good explanations right now are only or mostly in the work program and in the guidelines, whereas they are not legally binding. So I assume the model grant agreement for Marie Curie will be updated, because this is indeed contractual obligations, and we need to have them somewhere where we can point and say this is, and as you know, the guidelines are not binding in itself.
The guidelines are not binding, but the work program is. So the work program is legally binding.
Okay.
Yes, it's a legal document. So anything that's in the work program is legally binding. And for example, the work program, not in Marie Curie, but in different programs or in different calls, can say we're differing from the grant agreement in this area. So work program absolutely is legally binding. We're working on the annotated model grant agreement actively. I have a draft open in front of me, but I can't share it with you yet because it hasn't been endorsed by the legal service. But rest assured, it's very much in progress, and as soon as it's available, it will be published on the Funding and Tenders portal. However, another document that will help you a lot, which you will find on the Funding and Tenders portal, is the unit cost decision. So if you go to the reference documents, you will see all the work that was done behind these unit costs, and you will see much more detail than I'm giving you today. And that's a very, very useful guidance document. So it's on the Funding and Tenders portal in the reference documents section. And the full report and the commission decision is there.
Excellent.
So,
thank you.
You're welcome. So going back to the presentation, I will share again. Moving on to the institutional costs. So these are very much unchanged from Horizon 2020. They're costs relating to the research, training and networking contribution is related to the training and research expenses of the researchers and staff members, as well as related to the transfer of knowledge and networking activities. Now, the research, training and networking cannot be used to hire additional personnel. It must be used for the activities foreseen in the grant agreement. It can include tuition fees, cost of participation in conferences, trips related to work on the action, so secondments, short visits, training and language courses, etc. I understand from Anne and Marlies that there are a not uncommon question is what to do with leftover research training and networking contributions. In principle, there shouldn't be leftovers because this is the amount that we have determined you need as a minimum for these activities. However, if you have been quite frugal, then you have some funds left over towards the end of the project, what you can do is, for example, you can put on a final conference disseminating the results of the research. You can use it for course of publications related to the research. You can use it for promoting, for disseminating the results of the research. So you can use it as you like. This is a unit cost you receive, and it's up to you to use it for these activities. And even towards the end, if you think of new activities such as I mentioned, a final conference, etc., then these can all be used with the research training and networking contributions. I'm going to go into some detail in a few slides' time about records you need to keep with the research training and networking contribution. Or more correctly, the records you don't need to keep. Looking at management and indirect contributions. So in this case, you can use the management costs to hire personnel for project management and coordination. Every grant has indirect costs. Most institutions will have a percentage of the budget that they will take as indirect costs. And these are included in the management and indirect contribution. There is one exception to this, and this is if a beneficiary is receiving an operating grant financed by the EU or Euratom budget in the same period, then we can't provide the indirect costs unless you as the beneficiary can demonstrate cost separation. Now, cost separation is very detailed, so I'm not going to go into it here, especially as very few institutions have operating grants. But we have full details in the annotated model grant agreement. Whilst the Marie Curie grant annotated model grant agreement isn't yet published, a draft version of the main annotated model grant agreement is published, and there you can find the details on cost separation in that document also. And the rules remain unchanged from Horizon 2020, so you can also see the details in the Horizon 2020 annotated grant agreement. Finally, there's one last allowance we have to talk about in the cost categories, and this is the Cofunded Allowance. So the Cofund Allowance is contributing to the costs of the researchers and or costs related to training, research expenses, transfer of knowledge, networking activities. Now, the Cofund Allowance is equivalent to the minimum salary that needs to be paid to the researcher. This doesn't mean that the Cofund Allowance has to be used for this purpose, because the very nature of Cofund is that you are also getting funding from other sources to co-fund the program. So if your other funding stipulates, for example, that this funding must be used for the research, for the salaries, then you can use the Cofund Allowance to increase the amount up to the minimum rate and to cover the research and training and networking expenses. Or if the co-funding you receive covers the full minimum salary stipulated in the grant agreement, then you can use these funds exclusively for other activities. Now, like the other grants, so like doctoral networks, postdoctoral fellowships and staff exchange, if a co-fund grant is received, if a co-fund beneficiary is receiving an operating grant, then the costs of the contribution cannot cover indirect costs unless there's cost separation. However, unlike the others, in co-fund, the amount of funding, the unit cost, the allowance is not reduced. It's simply an instruction that it must be used for alternate expenses. Now, budget transfers. There's two types of budget transfers. There's transfers between beneficiaries and transfers between cost categories. So looking first at between beneficiaries, a budget transfer will happen between beneficiaries if there's a transfer of person months. It's allowed, provided it doesn't imply any substantive or important change to the action. And bear in mind that for doctoral networks, no more than 40% of the EU contribution can be allocated to beneficiaries in the same country or to a single international European research organization or an international organization. So if you are transferring person months between beneficiaries, make sure you respect this, what we call the 40% rule. It normally doesn't need an amendment, but as best practice, you should inform the PO in advance, because if it is a substantive or important change, then an amendment will be necessary. Now, the institutional unit contributions can be redistributed within the consortium. So, for example, if one beneficiary in doctoral networks is providing a large amount of the training, it might be that the consortium agrees via an internal arrangement to redistribute the institutional unit contributions towards this beneficiary. Similarly, if the fellow is going on secondment to a partner organization, then again, the unit contributions will be redistributed to this organization to cover some of the costs. This is all an internal agreement, and it's not considered for the purposes of the grant a budget transfer. Now, transfer between budget categories, it's not possible because we have unit costs and we have the budget per category. However, that doesn't mean that there is no flexibility. So the use of the amounts received have some flexibility. The cost for the researcher must absolutely be used for the researcher, but the research, training and networking contribution and the management and indirect contribution may have some unused amounts, and they can be used, for example, to increase the salary of a researcher or to cover travel and subsistence costs of a staff member in staff exchange, or, for example, to organize additional training activities. So this transfer between budget categories is allowed. And again, we mention here that the institutional unit contribution should be shared with associated partners or implementing partners, which incurred costs for research and training activities. And this is in Article 9 of the grant agreement. Now, I'm conscious that we've 10 minutes left, so it's good that we're coming to the last section, which is the conditions for the costs to be eligible. So these are unit costs, and this is important to remember. Now, for the cost to be eligible, essentially, the researcher or the seconded staff member has to be eligible, and the activities have to be implemented. So the staff member must fulfill the eligibility criteria and be appointed under the conditions set out in the grant agreement. The contributions must be used fully for the researcher, and if the contributions for the researcher are eligible, the contributions for the institution are automatically eligible. So if the researcher is employed, is paid fully, is eligible, and all the conditions of the grant agreement, such as appointed with the full employment contract, respects the minimum duration of 3 months, etc. As long as these are set out, the contributions are eligible. which brings me to the next logical question. What proof do we need to keep of the costs? So what you need to keep is the proof of the eligibility of the researcher staff member. And this includes the eligibility for family, long-term leave, and special needs allowances. You need to keep proof of the compliance of the terms with the grant agreement. So for example, you will have the employment contract of the researcher showing their working commitment to the action. You will have, for example, the vacancy notice you publish for doctoral networks and co-fund to recruit the researchers. And very importantly, you will have the proof of the use of the contributions for the researcher. And that includes payment, payroll records, contributions to social security, etc. For coordinators also, you should keep proof of transfer of payments to beneficiaries in case of any dispute. So these are the records that need to be kept. So if the contributions for the researcher are eligible, the contributions for the institution are automatically eligible. So you don't need to keep additional records. But remember, for staff members, for the secondment to RISE, it's good to keep proof of travel, because this is the travel to take up the secondment. So everything that you need to keep to prove the eligibility of the recruitment or the secondment of the staff member is needed for the audit. Now, on the online manual on the Funding and Tenders portal, there's a document called the Indicative Audit Programme. This document is shared with all of you, and it is the document that sets out how the auditors work. So this document is very useful if you want to know exactly what records to keep, because it shows you what the auditors will look at. It's not available yet for Horizon Europe because it's far too early in the program, but with the exception of the long-term leave and special needs, the requirements remain the same from Horizon 2020. So for more detail on the records to keep, I strongly advise you to consult the Indicative Audit Programme, the section for the Maris Skłodowska-Curie actions, because there it can be reassuring to see what the auditors will check and indeed what they don't check. And this document, as I said, is fully available. So that was a very quick introduction to the financial aspects of the Maris Skłodowska-Curie actions in Horizon Europe. I think we have time for some last questions. I hope the training was useful. And as I said, if you have questions later, don't hesitate to ask them via your project officer, and we will provide the answers to you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Thank you for your very good presentation. We've not received any more questions in the chat, so we can only conclude that that means that the presentation was very clear and on point and very good slides. There's a couple of raised hands. I think Arafa was first, so you're welcome to unmute and answer a question or ask a question.
Yes, thank you very much for the good presentation. I just had a question regarding the last part on records keeping. If you could give an example of, say the eligibility for the family allowance. If a person not being married, or would that be like a declaration that they would sign of family commitment, or how would that look like?
It's what your institution would normally need to pay such an allowance. So if they have it can be a rental agreement, for example, showing cohabitation. It can be a birth certificate of a child. It can be quite a wide range of documents, depending on what triggers the eligibility of the family allowance. but generally a rental agreement showing somebody cohabiting and that they've moved together for the fellowship shows that, well, they may not even have had to move together, but proof that they are cohabiting, that they're in a relationship in that respect is generally acceptable. What I advise you to do is have a look at that section of the indicative audit program. So if you go to the online manual to the section audits, you will find quite a detailed document there. And if you look at family allowance, you will see all the alternative evidences that the auditors can accept.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Paul?
Yep. Thank you again, Louise. One short follow-up question on this training cost allowance, because some institutions have a very detailed record keeping on what they use the training costs, and some have a rather loose or not that detailed record keeping. And I remember back in FP6 where there was this very detailed record keeping for training costs, and it was so complicated. Now it is the unit costs. And I remember back in the old days, our best deliverable was a happy fellow. So as I understand it, you said no other records needed for the training cost, except we have to prove that we gave what was needed for the fellow to be conferences, travel, or whatever. But can you confirm that we don't need to make specific accounting on the training costs as we used to in the old days? Thank you.
For the purposes of the Maris Skłodowska-Curie grant agreement, you do not need to keep detailed records of the use of the institutional costs. What your institution might require is another story, and that's not for us to comment on. But for the purposes of the grant, you don't need to keep such detailed records. What you need to show is that the training took place. So you will have lab books, you will have training course attendance, you will have all these, you will have, for example, presentations given at conferences. All this shows that the activities took place. And that's what we need to see to make sure that the fellow was trained. But we don't need to see the costs of the training broken down. So we spent X euro on consumables, X euro on access to equipment, etc. All that we don't need to see.
Thank you.
But again, I think the indicative audit program is a very little known document, but can be very useful to Marie Curie beneficiaries to see exactly what it is the auditors will look for.
Thank you. Then I think Tatjana has a question as well.
Yes, hi, and thank you for a lovely presentation, Louise. This is sort of a follow-up question to Paul's. We occasionally are in this situation, have been for the last few years because of the pandemic, that not all of the research and training and networking funds were actually would have been spent during the project because fellows were not able to travel or spend the money as planned. We have done in accordance with the project officers agreed upon, so spending the project topped off the salary with the amounts. Occasionally we have some funds that still remain unspent at the end of the project. What is the best thing to do with that? Do we pay that to the fellow? Because that's sort of
if the researcher was eligible, if the research training activities took place, so if the project was well implemented, the unit is eligible. Okay. So you have to decide how best to use these funds. I think perhaps something that could happen if the researchers didn't manage to get together much because of the pandemic, maybe something like a final conference could help with the networking again. And could help to establish, even if it's after the end of the grant, because it's a unit cost, it doesn't matter if the conference takes place after the end of the grant.
Okay, so if we occasionally, this could happen, sort of pay out the funds directly to the fellow, would that be an eligible cost at the end of the project, sort of under the sort of circumstances that would be spent in the future, but we wouldn't know? or do we have to sort of make sure that the conference organization is made during the project, or how to manage?
No, as long as the activities, as long as the project has been properly implemented, so as long as the researchers have been recruited, are eligible, have been paid, and have had the research training and networking foreseen in the grant agreement or later deviations agreed with the project officer, the unit cost is eligible.
Okay.
How it is used, whether it is in top-up salaries to the researcher, whether it's activities taking place after the end of the project, it's up to you.
Okay, but it has to be sort of to the benefit of the researcher. It cannot go into sort of the university funds.
That's not the intention. The intention is it's used for the project. But my point remains on the eligibility, but the intention, this is European funds, so it was foreseen for the project. So
okay,
I would use it to promote the project. For example, to do a report, a final report that could be disseminated with the results of the research, which can also serve as inspiration for future people applying for funding. Like it can serve as a communication for promotion of doctoral networks in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Good. I don't see any more raised hands or questions in the chat. So I think that brings us to the end of the webinar here today. Again, thank you very much, Louise, for your very clear presentation and for your time here today. And thank you all for attending. For those of you who have about 30 seconds left to spare, we just have a very short poll to ask how you received the webinar here today, and it's 3 very short questions. So if you have time, please answer these questions, and with that, we'll conclude the webinar today.
Yes, also from my side, thank you, Louise, very much for your very clear presentations and answers to questions, and thank you for the participation of everyone.
Thank you very much.